Our next speaker in this part is Dr. Fatima Tofighi with the title Moral, Accountability, and Quranic Exegesis. This speech will be held in English. Dr. Fatima Tofighi is an Iranian researcher and assistant professor. She holds a PhD in literature and religions from the Glasgow University. Dr. Tofighi teaches religious and Mysticism at University of Tehran, University of Religious and Demonstration. She published some important articles, from them some about freedom and the concept of children of God, interpretation of the sins of the prophets, and translated some related books from English to Persian. In this session, she will give a speech on the subject that I have sold before. Dr. Tofighi?
Yeah. Okay. Thank you very much for your introduction. So I have these slides which I would like to present. Yeah. I'm honored and pleased to be here. Thanks to the organizers and guests who are now listening. So do you see my presentation?
Yeah, we can see it. Thank you.
So actually, it is interesting that my topic is almost the same as the topic of the entire conference. So sometimes it doesn't make sense if you take it just as broad. But the point is that and ideas on this particular topic. And that is why after Dr. Swani invited me, I thought I'd present this here. And then we'll see that it is not as broad as the title of a conference. So when we are talking about ethical responsibility in modern exegesis, in modern Quranic exegesis, we can think of two kinds of tafsir, first of all. One of them is liberationist tafsirs. They started almost in the 19th century, although we have had liberationist tafsirs even before that, but we all know that toward the end of the 19th century, there was this wave of exegesis, this trend in exegesis where authors tried to make the Quran contemporary, to make it relevant to their own times. And so they dealt with questions about the relation between Quranic verses and science, or ethical questions like women's issues, like democracy, like different things that they thought were relevant in their social and political climate, and how the Quran is taking a stance in different things. So we are familiar with this idea that they promoted some sort of democracy, saying that Quran had supported Shura, or they were talking about liberty, or they were talking about equality. For example, they talked about gender equality, although they supported the a version of equality like complementarity theory. And they always focused on justice, and sometimes they even stressed the importance of revolution. So that is how actually much of the 20th century tafsir was developing, and many movements were inspired by these kinds of tafsirs, and many people, like they became so dominant that their kind of tafsir was taken as the word of the Quran. But then toward the end of the 20th century mainly, and also in the 21st century, there were others who tried to reject this kind of liberationist approach, claiming that it was inaccurate and that it actually sacrificed the Quran for these political agendas. So that is why they tried to say we should be loyal to the main meaning of the text. So yeah, so we should take historical and literary approaches and try to understand what the Quran was talking about in its historical setting, how it is understandable as a text, and we can apply different methods in understanding it. So they try to get away from these liberationist approaches. Actually, I'd like to emphasize that these liberationist tendencies didn't leave us ever. We have had to deal with questions most importantly relating to gender equality, but also other social issues. But the point is that in the Quranic studies, there was this trend that these liberationist tafsirs were not as accurate as a tafsir should be. So actually, I had examined a number of articles in Farsi which did not directly speak about liberationist approaches, but when they were talking about the ethics of interpretation, they meant an ethics of research or an ethics of belief. That is, they emphasized methods in understanding truth, not the relevance of the text for a believer. So they said that one should follow the right methods and get at the intention of the author. And sometimes some even said that one should also respect what people before us had said about a particular verse and so on. So actually, based on a reading of these recent works on ethics of interpretation, I was intrigued to write this paper in the first place, trying to see, I mean, actually my main argument, as we will see, is that when they're talking about methods of research, it's not all that is there in terms of ethics of interpretation. So ethics of interpretation is about ethics of research, but it's also, excuse me, but it's also more than that. And it's broader than that, and it includes many other areas. Excuse me. Just a moment. I have to get some water. Okay. So, yeah. So that I was saying that at this point in history, people learned. Actually, there were people who were saying that ethics of interpretation is ethics of research, and I want to argue in this talk that it is much more and broader than that. So to make my case, first of all, I talk about the problems of liberationist approaches. Actually, I mentioned this. I said that liberationist approaches were helpful in many respects. They were able to actually help people think about serious issues of their contemporary times in terms of religion and try to develop liberationist theologies. But the problem was that the entire Quran seems to be subjected to a particular political agenda. So if you're saying that the Quran is a book of law, then you are trying to subject the entire Quran to a legal system. Or if you're saying that the Quran is the book of democracy and understanding how our political systems should run, then you are at that time subjecting the Quran to that bigger agenda, and so on and so forth. But when we also talk about historical approaches, there are problems in that too, because the Quran is not just like any book. I mean, what I'm arguing could be just as true for any other book as well. But the Quran is a book upon which people regulate their lives. So a lot of people believe in this book and like to follow this book, and it's important for them to understand this book as a regulating principle. So it's not something to read and to understand only and leave it there. It's something that directs your life after you understand it. We have to think about an ethical interpretation in a way that is considering the problems of these two approaches. That is, it tries not to subjugate the Quran or subject the Quran to an overarching project, but it is not also trying to understand only the meaning of the text in its own historical milieu and leaving it there. So it's more than that. And the necessity of my argument is that it's not that these two approaches are problematic, but the point is that we do see wrong uses of the scriptures. I mean, the way the scriptures are used for promoting violence, and that is why we have to be careful about what is going on and what is at stake here. So if someone says that, oh, I understand from the meaning of the Quran that you should go on jihad, or that you should beat your wives, or that these kinds of things, then it's not only about understanding, it's about preventing the violence that might ensue from the scriptures. And then the other point is that the necessity of moral accountability in Tafsir is that we should also examine a particular question from different aspects. That is, when, for example, we are trying to understand the meaning of verse 34 in Surah 4, which talks about men's guardianship over women, or which talks about beating women if they disobey and these kinds of things, we are not only dealing with words, we are, as researchers, dealing with different aspects, and we may, of course, say, yeah, I deal with this aspect, but the point is that we should consider different aspects, even if our research is focused on one particular aspect. And the other thing that makes it necessary for us to consider moral accountability in Tafsir is the idea of the situatedness of knowledge. The fact that any kind of knowledge doesn't come forth in a vacuum. So any knower is influenced by their situation and their situatedness. So if a person is interpreting the Quran, they should be aware that even if they are doing historical research, they are influenced by their situation in the society, or as an individual, or like their faith, their gender, their economic class, their political and social situations that are affecting them directly. So if all knowledge is situated, then we have to be careful how our own presuppositions might influence our research. So it's not only method, it's also the situatedness of the researcher or the exegete in question. So now that I have talked about these two approaches, and then I have talked about the problems that exist in these two approaches, and then I make a moral case, I make a case for the necessity of taking into account one's moral accountability in Tafsir, I would like to mention some alternative perspectives, like perspectives that were not exactly in the liberationist or the historical, or like combine them with each other. The first is historicization. Historicization means trying to relegate a piece to history. First of all, studying it in history, and then saying how its historical situation is different from the one we are living in. It's mostly known by the name of Fazlur Rahman, who developed this two-movement theory of interpretation, where he said that interpretation involves two movements, one movement from our contemporary time to the past, and then understanding the passage in question in its own historical milieu, and then after getting the core message, bringing it into our own day and time, like bringing the message and applying it in our own history and day and time. It does have certain problems. It's been very influential, at least on feminist exegesis of the Quran. It has had its own problems. For example, Farid Esack has criticized Rahman for not considering the situatedness of the person who is doing the research themselves. And also, Esack has also criticized Rahman for ignoring praxis. Esack himself, who was an activist in apartheid South Africa, although he agrees with this idea of historicization, he tries to develop it in a new way by considering the hermeneutic keys. Hermeneutic keys are certain overarching themes in the Quran, in light of which other verses should be understood and read. For example, if we know that a key idea in the Quran is Tawheed, then that it will help everything that we are reading in the Quran. Or if we know that justice is a key theme, then we are able to take that key to understand or unlock other passages in the Quran. And there are also authors who try to see this problem as part of their problem on the more general question of the conflict between science and religion, reason and religion, or the ethics and religion. So, for example, Abul Qasim Fanai in Iran has written on this topic where he is saying that so we should consider Quranic verses on the same level as rational premises, and we shouldn't give more weight to the Quranic verses when we are weighing rational premises and Quranic verses. So they are on the same level, and we should see which wins, actually, which premise wins. So that is also very helpful. And I think especially if we are in our kalam, we are justice oriented or adli, then we would agree with what Fanai is saying, although usually in jurisprudence, those who are in kalam usuli adli don't follow in jurisprudence this maxim. So that is why Fanai's understanding is rather radical, but I think it shouldn't be because it follows on kalam. Now we reach my own suggestions based on what we've studied. So, and just as I said, I argue that we should do rigorous historical research. So our main aim should be to understand the text, but that doesn't mean that we are free from ethical considerations, and we should take into account our ethical accountability to the community of the believers, because the Quran is just not like any other book. It might lead to violent uses and violent readings, and then it might be problematic on the ground. So one of my suggestions is that we should be prepared to critically assess what has been said before. So the fact that an authority in the past has interpreted the Quran in a certain way doesn't mean that it is the right way to interpret the Quran. Rather, we should critically approach that particular author to see what their grounds, what their reasons for a particular interpretation is, and how much they are themselves situated in a particular context, and that is why they are interpreting in that way. My other suggestion is to take into account a hermeneutics of suspicion. Hermeneutics of suspicion is a term that has been suggested by Paul Ricoeur and then developed by this Catholic feminist theologian Elizabeth Schussler Fiorenza to talk about an approach to the text where you don't agree with whatever the text is talking about, but trying to see the underlying motivations that exist in the text. So you try to approach the text by seeing why a particular thing has been said. Actually, I know that applying hermeneutics of suspicion to the Quran is a bit problematic because we consider the Quran to be the very word of God, so we cannot so easily talk about the motivations that are underlying a particular passage. But at the same time, I think we have this history of applying some sort of hermeneutics of suspicion especially when we are saying that a particular passage was for a specific situation and for a particular group of people, and that is actually where we are talking about underlying motivations and assumptions. And similarly, we can also talk about hermeneutics of suspicion, especially if, for example, we say that the Quran was developed or emerged or revealed in a patriarchal setting, and then we shouldn't be surprised that it speaks to that patriarchal setting, and then try to strip it off from that patriarchal background. The other suggestion is to open up a dialogue with those who are advantaged or disadvantaged by what is said in the Quran or in the Tafsir. So in Tafsir, we usually have had this tradition of having these older, learned men telling us what the Quran is talking about. But we could now especially, we could have an open floor for women, for even the less educated ones, although I can understand that there are problems with understanding certain passages if you don't have some amount of education. But I think it is important to see who is advantaged or disadvantaged by a particular passage and in what ways. And then when this dialogue is opened up, then there is an opportunity for considering or for asking certain questions critically. Generally, actually, this is my entire suggestion, but I mean more particularly that whenever we are doing historical research, with any finding, we should consider how it affects the daily lives of flesh and blood Muslims and non-Muslims. So we should not only consider a particular circle of learned exegetes, but also those who fall outside this circle learned exegetes, those who are less educated, those even who are not Muslims, and how we are accountable to them as humans. So this historical research cannot just stand there as it is. Now, to wrap up what I've been talking about, so I suggested that in modern times we've been flourishing of liberationist readings of the Quran, which has been criticized by a number of scholars who are trying to take a historical and literary approach to the Quran, and they have also sometimes when we see the literature around the ethics of interpretation, it is mostly on the interpretation of the Quran as some sort of research. So certain methods should be followed, the intention of the author should be learned, older authorities should be respected, and the main idea is to follow the method step by step and to get at the truth. But the problem is that we need to have historical rigor, but we cannot say that we can stay outside any sort of moral accountability, like in a closed room where the interpretation of the Quran doesn't have any influence on people. So that is why I suggested that we should have both historical and literary approaches and moral accountability in a way that doesn't subject the Quran to a political agenda, but at the same time is aware of the problems that believers have while reading the Quran and trying to find ways for them to live with the Quran. And my suggestions were, as I said, a critical assessment of previous literature, hermeneutics of suspicion, dialogue with those who are at stake, and considering the consequences of a particular passage on the daily lives of Muslims and non-Muslims, and even the more disadvantaged among the Muslims. Thank you for your attention, and I close my talk here.